I'm Jono Buchanan. Now, as you know, on this channel, one of the things that I'm always advocating is new ways of making sound. What I'm always really interested in is sort of taking productions on a few steps and sort of stepping out of the kind of conventional ways of sound designing or creating treatments for the sounds that you're working with and finding new ways of doing that. And this video is dedicated to that idea. We're going to bring together a couple of things that we've looked at in the past to see whether or not we can create a unique and quite interesting sound treatment. Now, a few months ago, I made a track called the One Note track. And if you haven't watched that video, I would strongly advise you to go and do so. What we effectively did was to take one note and create a little sort of 8-bar loop from a series of treatments. And amongst those treatments were a series of what we call ghost rhythms taken from Space Designer. Now, Space Designer is Logic's convolution reverb. And the way that you're kind of supposed to use Space Designer is that you're supposed to call up one of the sampled spaces to use as a reverb within your tracks. What convolution reverb does is to allow you to make a recording of a space and then to put a sound of your choice into that space and to create a reverb solution for it that way. So in other words, we have a chance to produce these ultra realistic reverb spaces. But one thing that Apple have done a really nice job of is to create some really warped, interesting treatments within Space Designer as well. And the ghost rhythms are little rhythmic audio files which can be convolved around any sound you like to feed those in and to trigger a series of kind of ghost rhythms from any sound that you feed into Space Designer. Well, we're going to create an impulse response of our own in this video. This is effectively going to take any audio file and allow it to be brought into Space Designer so that we can treat that audio file as a sort of reverb for any sound that we put into it. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. What I've done is to sequence one note for the worn tape piano, which is a preset within the inspector, so you can go and find this sound. And I've programmed one note which sounds like this. Literally the most exciting thing that's ever happened on this channel. Okay, so what I'm going to do firstly is to turn it into an audio file. What we've got at the moment is this piece of MIDI, and what the impulse response needs to be for me to load it into Space Designer is an audio file. So I can do that very easily by simply bouncing this file in place, Control-click on it, select Bounce in Place. And what we're going to do is to literally just call it worn tape piano. But what I'm going to do is to put impulse response or IR on the end so I know what that file is, and I'm going to press OK. And what that's going to do is to turn the file into an audio file. Now, I don't need to trigger it from this track, and I certainly don't need the MIDI anymore either. So what I'm going to do is to leave those two things here. The next thing I'm going to need is a track to trigger the sound which I've just created, which we're going to put into Space Designer. In order, I need something which is going to feed into this Space Designer treatment once we've made it. So what I'm going to do is to come down to this kit, the Low Down Dub kit, which is an ultra beat kit. And I'm going to create some beats. Okay, let's just put a sort of one bar loop together. There's 1 bar of beats. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to quantize those into 16th notes. And what I'm also going to do, and we'll see why in just a moment, is I'm actually going to duplicate this track and I'm going to split out the 3 voices that I've just written onto 3 different tracks. I want this one to be just the kick. So I'm going to double click on the MIDI. I'm going to select the kick, which I think is on C1 down here, by clicking on it here. And then what I'm going to do is use one of my favorite key commands for stripping out MIDI, which is Shift and I. And what that does is to select everything apart from the note that I just clicked on, and then I can hit backspace to remove it. So let's do that again. This is just now going to be my kick, which I can label that way. I'm going to click here, and I want this to just be the snare. So I'm going to click on the snare. Sure enough, there it is. Shift and I, and then I can get rid of the kick and the hats. And then this one is going to be just the hats. So if I click on the note that's triggering it, and I hit Shift and I, I'm going to select the kick and the snare. And again, I can hit backspace and they're all gone. So this is my snare. And this is the hats track. Capital H is important. And I'm going to select all of those, and I'm just going to use my little key command of Shift, Option and N to rename those regions based on the sounds that are triggering them. Okay, so that sounds like this. Okay, so what we've now got is these separate things happening, and of course what I can do is to repeat them. And if you watch this channel with any regularity, you'll know I'm all about the colours, and these drums are going to be blue. Okay, there we are. Don't ask me why, they just are blue, okay? Okay, fine, so we've got our individual sounds. Now, what I want to do is I want to send one of these sounds to a version of my worn tape piano, which I want to bring into Space Designer as an impulse response. So let's select the kick to start with. What I'm going to do is to set up a new auxiliary send. Bus 1 is available. I'm going to turn up the send level, and what I'm going to do is to drop down into the reverbs, and I'm going to come to Space Designer and select that plugin. Okay, so here it is. And normally what I can do is to come into the presets and come and find the regular reverb spaces that I might want to use. And you can see that they're categorized in different ways: large spaces, medium spaces, small spaces. And we were looking at the warped effects and some of the ghost rhythms, which are here when we looked at the one-note track. Now, what I want to do is not select a preset. Instead, what I want to do is to go and find the opportunity to load in my own impulse response. So I'm going to click on that option here, and then what I have a chance to do is to go and browse to the area where I might want to find it. So I'm going to come into my project, which is going to be here. I'm going to come and find it, and in the audio files, here is my worn tape piano impulse response. And what I'm going to do is to press open. And what that's going to do is to load in the entirety of the audio file that I created. Now remember, I created a really long audio file because I bounced down 2 bars and my tempo is 70 BPM. So this is sort of 5.28 seconds in length, this entire reverb. Now remember, the reverb isn't a reverb, it's my worn tape piano. So if I was just to trigger this, if I was to select a single note, in fact I'll play it on the keyboard, what exactly is going to happen? Well, effectively the kick drum is going to be convolved within the worn tape piano audio file. Now, there are a couple of things I can do here. Firstly, what I'm going to do is to change the length. I don't want the entirety of this audio file to play. I'm going to reconvolve it around something much shorter. And as you'll know, if you have ever spent any time working with Space Designer, rather than simply selecting the first 1.26 seconds of the file, you can see that the file has actually changed. Effectively, what's happened is that Space Designer has resampled this sound to create a sort of slightly different version of it based on the length that I've selected. Still going to sound the same, but it's much, much shorter. Okay, so I've also got the reverse option here. So one thing I could do would be to sort of trigger this sound in this way, but you might be thinking, well, why not simply just take the audio file and chop it up? In other words, have the audio file just be triggered every time the kick happens. Well, we'll see in a moment that we aren't getting the whole of this file. What we're getting is the part of it that relates to the kick drum that's feeding into it. Now, my kick drum is mostly a bassy sound, but it's got some high frequency content in it as well. But we'll see in a moment when I feed a different sound into it that we get a different response from the worn tape piano based on the fact that it's being triggered by a different sound in the first place. So what I want to do first of all is to just see if I can shape this sound a little bit so that it makes musical sense in the context of the way that I want to feed it. So again, I'm going to make it a forward sound for a moment, but what I'm particularly keen to try and do is to firstly find a little bit of a length for the sound that feels like it's appropriate, but also maybe spend a little bit of time with pre-delay and create an opportunity for the kick drum to happen before the reverb then kicks in. So let's put a loop around these 2 bars and just see if we can fashion a kind of shape out of this sound which sounds appropriate and interesting for the track. Okay, I like that. The other thing I'm going to do is to come up here to the filter envelope for the sound and turn the filter on. And I'm also going to select the high pass version of the filter. I'm just going to see what happens if I can sort of create a bit of a shape here that feels like it's changing the tone of this sound and the way that that might behave over time a little bit as well. Let's just have a little bit of a look at how that might sound. Okay, I really like that little kick back in towards the end of the file. Okay, let's just hear that with the other drums as well and just see how this sound is now feeling like it's part of this track. Okay, I really like that. So we've got this kind of drone tone that's happening. Effectively, the kick now being wrapped around, if you like, this audio file that we created from the piano. Now, a little while ago, I talked about the fact that the sound that's triggering it, the kick drum, is going to behave differently in terms of the kind of bits of this audio file compared to another sound. I'll show you what I mean. If I was to take this treatment off the kick drum for a moment, so it's not happening here at all, and instead what I did was to feed the snare drum into this treatment instead, we'll get a different sound. This is how the piano sounds wrapped, or the snare drum sounds wrapped in the piano rather than the kick drum wrapped in the piano. So that's a different experience compared to the kick drum, which sounds like this. And the snare again. So here we've got this much more mid-rangey kind of resonant sound. Now, in fact, I need to be careful. If I was to push the send level up too much with this sound, it'll start to distort and break up like that, which I don't want. So effectively, the other real advantage of having separated the individual parts of this out onto different tracks is that I can obviously send a different amount of level from the snare compared to the kick, for instance. Again, what would happen if I was to feed it from the hats instead? Well, let's have a listen to that. Again, it's this first treatment up here that we're interested in. Okay, so again, we get this very different effect, partly based on the level of the signal, but also the frequency content of it as well. So let's put them all in for a moment. Let's just come back into here and we'll just see what happens when we send all three of these sounds into this treatment. Okay, and of course, if we want to, we can make the Space Designer treatment just the beginning of the way that a sound like this might behave. What do I mean? Okay, well, let's suppose what we wanted to do would be to say, okay, well, I want this to last a bit longer, this little rhythm that's being built out of the way that the Space Designer treatment is being filtered. We could pick up on that by maybe sending it into a delay. I could, for instance, sort of add an 8th dotted delay, make that slightly diffuse, pick up the feedback amount a little bit. So effectively, some of the signal, 30% of it, is going to be sort of treated, or 40% is going to be treated through this tape delay treatment. So we're going to end up with this kind of slightly skippier, repeated, delayed treatment instead. And of course, because this audio file is a C and it's sitting there kind of being this kind of drone consistent sort of sound that we're using the whole way through, the other thing to do might be to maybe bring in a sort of pitched instrument alongside it to see what happens if we sort of widen the musical context for a treatment like this. So this is a little arpeggiated sound. And it might be interesting to put in something like this alongside the beats. So I'm just experimenting with different chords here, but because the C is constant as a result of the fact that that is the impulse response pitch, as a result, we suddenly get this kind of new way of having a kind of fixed drone running through the track with other sounds around it. So effectively what we've done within this video is to take the idea of any note, turn it into audio, and then use that as an impulse response within Space Designer. And what that does is to wrap any sounds that you kind of feed into it into that space. And the space just happens to be the inside of this piano note, if you like. And effectively what we can then do is to trigger different parts of its frequency spectrum from different sounds with different frequency content, but we can also shape it from a filtering point of view, from its length, and then we can add other effects. And of course, you could go absolutely to town with that. I could add filters to the kind of treatment of that Space Designer signal if I wanted to. And as we've just started to do with this little arpeggiator sound, effectively what we can then do is to kind of create a harmonic foundation for the way that that sound behaves as well. So all kinds of interesting things you can do when you turn any sound into an impulse response for Space Designer.